So another lifter has sent you this video because they want you to handle them at a competition. Or you're about to handle someone but you're not sure what to do as a handler. So in this video, we will go through everything that you need to know about your role and responsibility as a handler, things that you should do as a handler, and things that you should avoid doing as a handler. If you're new here, my name is Norman Chung and I'm a powerlifting coach for over 10 years and I've coached lifters up to international level. When it comes to handling, every powerlifter will have their own individual needs. So how you handle may differ between different lifters. So it's super important that you establish this at the very start. First, let's define the role of a handler. Now, the handler is responsible for managing the lifter's journey through the competition, including the warm-up, ensuring they follow through with the competition schedule, selecting the attempts, as well as providing a little bit of technical and mental support depending on the lifter. And your role is to make the process as seamless as possible and take away any extra stress or thinking from the lifter so that the lifter can actually channel their energy and focus on just competing. Ultimately, you want the lifter to be able to just turn up and execute. Also, as a handler, you want to be the objective decision maker if decisions need to be made on the spot. So that's your general role. So let's talk about some pre-competition preparation. The lifter that you're handling may or may not have a coach. If your lifter does not have a coach and they're self-coached, there may be more discussion to be had before the competition day. So one of the main things that you want to be able to establish is actually to mutually define your role as a handler to that lifter. So every lifter will have different needs regardless of whether they are a new lifter or an experienced lifter. Now, different lifters will want different levels of autonomy, but generally speaking, newer lifters will want you to take charge more. Occasionally, experienced lifters will also want you to take charge equally as much as well. So a very important discussion to be had when it comes to this is, do they want to have a say in the attempts during the competition? Now, if they do, who gets to make the final call? Do they want you to completely take over the attempt selection? And if they want you to completely take over the attempt selection, one thing that you shouldn't do is to go asking them what they want to do for an attempt after they've just done a lift. So one of the things that you really need to understand to a T is to understand the hierarchy of the competition goals. Now, this is going to be important as different lifters will have different priorities in terms of goals. So, some lifters may just want to prioritize being able to qualify for a competition. Some lifters just want to be able to PB, and some lifters just want to be able to place a certain position. And if competing against someone else is going to be a big goal of theirs, it may also be useful to just quickly look up the progress of other lifters, such as using the Open IPF website or looking through their social media. And if this is the case, as a handler, you also want to pay a little bit more attention to the scoreboard and watching those competitors as well. And if you are handling someone who is a bit more neurotic, you may want to discourage them from getting distracted from the scoreboard in the competition. And the next thing you want to try and understand and establish is the game day plan, so the attempt selections. As with any sort of competition prep, you also want to have an attempt selection. So as long as it seems like there is a sensible one, you should try your best to try and stick with it. Obviously, there will be situations where you will need to deviate from it if things don't go according to plan. You want to ensure that there is a plan A if performance is going as planned, and a plan B if things do not go as well. And this is important. This is so that you know exactly what you need to do when it comes to making decisions after seeing each attempt finish. It's also worth discussing signs when things are not necessarily going well. For example, how the lifts may look if they are harder than usual. Like, do they normally show a certain sticking point at a certain point of the lift? And that's normally an indicator that they're hitting their top end pretty soon, and things like that. If the lifter does have their own coach, you may not need to worry too much about discussing the plan for the attempt selection. And if the lifter does not have their own coach, you may want to offer your own thoughts on attempt selection. Obviously, if you are not experienced enough to be able to contribute anything useful, then you don't need to worry too much about this. The next thing is to consider what you need to bring as a handler. Now, some competitions, especially with the high level competitions, will require you to bring in your federation membership card or number. So ensure that you have a saved copy on your phone or printed out, because let's say it is stored on your email and you don't necessarily have good Wi-Fi connection at the venue, you're going to have a tough time getting it up. Depending on what level of competition that you go to, there's a high chance that you're going to be needing a pen to write on the attempt slips, because the last thing you want is to try and find someone else's pen to try and write attempts. And also, it's worth bringing plenty of water and snacks for yourself as well, so that you stay energized throughout the whole competition day, so that you can actually focus and actually be useful in supporting the lifter. And the last thing that you want is to be tired and lose focus. You also don't want to be trying to hunt down for food during the competition, because there may not necessarily be guaranteed a place where you can get a good amount of food. If the lifter doesn't have their own coach, it may be useful just to offer them some friendly reminders the day before the competition. So you may also want to double check with the lifter that they have everything that they need for the competition, including all of the competition attire, their lifting equipment, as well as food, drink, and important documents such as ID and membership card. So let's move on to the competition day. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the weigh-in. When you get to the venue, spend time figuring out where the weigh-ins are done. So check out whether there is a weighing list. Normally at high level competitions, there is normally a weighing order list with lifters' names on it with lot numbers attached to it. So familiarize yourself with when the lifter needs to weigh in and keep an eye on the progress of the weigh-in as it goes on. So it may be useful just to keep the lifter updated every few minutes on when it will be their turn to weigh in. And the other two places that you need to try and figure out is where the rack heights are done and also where the kit check is done. Now, depending on how far down the lifter is on that weigh-in list, if there is one, if the lifter does have a fair bit of time before it's their turn to weigh in, you may want to consider taking the lifter through the kit check and the rack heights first. Also figure out where the toilets are as well as changing rooms if they are separate. And once you've done all three things, you also want to familiarize yourself with where the warm-up room is and where the platform is. Now, depending on where the competition venue is, you may want to take note on things such as whether there is limited space or equipment in the warm-up room, as you may find yourself fighting over a rack or over when lifters do their warm-up sets. You also want to pay attention to where the scoreboards are so you can keep track of the timing through the competition. So another thing that's worth keeping an eye on towards the end of the weigh-ins is to see whether the schedule of the day has changed or not. Sometimes people don't necessarily turn up for the competitions, and that can change the number of lifters in each class, which can affect the structure of the lifting flights and groups. So it's worth keeping an ear out for announcement to changes in proceedings. And if you are not sure, it's always useful to double check with the organizers about whether the schedule has changed or not. So let's move on to the next one, which is warm-up proceedings. Now, when it comes to warming up, take into consideration of how long it takes the lifters to get dressed and prepared as well. Sometimes you do have lifters who take their sweet ass time to getting ready to get under the bar. And this might be things including like taking their time putting their knee sleeves on, etc, etc. So make sure you know where the lifter is a few minutes before you want to get them to get under the bar. Because the last thing that you want is for you to want them to get under the bar and they still haven't gotten changed yet and they need to take 15 minutes to go to the toilet and get dressed to get ready under the bar. When the lifter is warming up, make sure you are familiar with what the warm-up sets are going to be, how much time the lifter wants or needs between warm-up sets, as well as how quickly the previous flight is proceeding if there is one before. Otherwise, pay attention to how many minutes until lift-off. If it is possible to check, find out where your lifter is in the order of the fly-off coming out. So this will help you time all the warm-up sets so that the lifter has plenty of time to rest between the last warm-up and their opening attempt. And an important rule to remember is the deadline for changing openers, which you can only do once, which is either 3 minutes before the start of the round or 3 lifters if you are a later group. And it's super important that you understand any direct or indirect signals that the lifter wants or needs to pass for a change in opening attempts. Depending on who the lifter is, they may not necessarily tell you this, but if the warm-ups look much harder than they should, or they're not hitting competition quality execution, you may want to tell the lifter that you would like to change their opening attempts to a lower number. For example, if the lifter is not hitting depth on the squat and it doesn't look like they're having a good chance to being able to do so, you may want to tell them that they're not hitting depth and that you think that they should drop the opener just in case they don't bomb out. It's always useful to stay a little bit more conservative and make bigger jumps in subsequent second and third attempts than it is to risk it with a slightly higher attempt that they can't get white lights for. So the next discussion is selecting the attempts. Now, selecting the right attempts is going to be crucial. The first attempt should be something that the lifter can confidently hit even on a bad day, and this builds confidence and secures a total. Now, the second and third attempts can be a bit more aggressive, and obviously you want the third to be close to or at the 1 rep max, based on how the lifter is feeling that day and what their goals are for the day. The other thing that you also need to know is where the attempt slips need to go. And also remember that you do have only 60 seconds to submit your attempt after the lift has been completed. If you do have attempt slips, remember that you are going to have 3 slips for squats, 3 slips for bench press, and 5 for deadlift. The first slip for squat and bench press are optional ones for if you want to change your opening attempts. And the other 2 are going to be for the second and third attempts, which is simple enough. For the deadlifts, you have 1 for the opening change, you have 1 for the second attempt, and then you have 3 slips for the final attempts, as you can change your attempt twice for the final deadlift. So let's go through some important rules for attempt changes. There are going to be 2 main rules that you need to remember for the final round of the deadlifts. The first rule is that there is a rising bar, so the load of the barbell cannot go down. And the second rule is that the barbell with the same load is executed in the order of lot number, which is the number that is assigned to you at weigh-ins. So the key things that you need to pay attention to on the scoreboard are basically the total that the lifters would hit if they did or did not get their final attempts. If you do need to get your lifter to try and beat another lifter, and you need to increase your attempt, you have until before your load has been loaded and that the center referee says bar. If those two keywords have been announced, then it is too late for any attempt changes. If you are to drop your attempt, you cannot drop to below what the load is that is already on the platform, and your lifter's lot number cannot be lower than the last lifter who went if you are attempting the same weight. So here are some examples. If Adam, who is lot number 5, has just done 200 kilos and they're about to start loading for the next lifter, if you want to drop down to 200 kilos, but your lifter's lot number is number 4, the lowest number that you can drop the bar down to is 202.5. But if your lifter's lot number is 6, then you can drop it down to 200 kilos. So let's move on to talk about failed attempts. Now, if after the first or second attempt there were 2 or 3 red lights, and if it's not obvious how they failed the lift, you also want to check the color code associated with the reason for the red light. Now, this may differ depending on which federation the lifter is competing in. As I generally work with lifters who compete in the IPF, here is a quick snapshot for the color codes. As a very general rule, if a lifter hasn't got a lift in, you are probably better off repeating the load just to not bomb out from the competition. If they already have at least 1 lift in, and if they didn't fail because they weren't strong enough, you may want to consider going up anyways. But this really massively depends on the context of the failure, for example, missing commands, and what the goal of the competition is as well, especially if your lifter is a competitive powerlifter who is either fighting to qualify or for placing. The next thing we're going to talk about is providing support. Now, mental and emotional support is just as important as the physical preparation in the warm-ups, and keeping the lifter in the right headspace is often key for optimal performance. Now, I say the right headspace because the right headspace for different lifters will look different externally. So some lifters will need a bit more psyching up, whereas some lifters need a bit more of a calm and composure. And if you're not sure, discussing how the lifter wants you to be during the competition is going to be very important. As for yourself as a handler, it's also useful to use positive reinforcement and just staying composed, even if things do not necessarily go as planned. Because the last thing that you want is for lifters to self-sabotage if an earlier lift does not go well, and they're also feeding off your anxiety as well. Common things that you should not do is to start to give lifters cues that they don't need or use. If you are going to use a cue, definitely want to make sure that they are cues that the lifter explicitly wants you to use. So don't use any back slaps or any physical contact that the lifter has not requested, as this may completely distract them from focus. So I hope you guys found that useful. If I've missed any key point out, please write it in the box below. And as always, thank you for watching. Click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.